would you then use the same frame of argument that you have in understanding the whole idea of Adivasi democracies, Adivasi citizenship? Because Jaipal Singh was a very, very different kind of figure from Birsa Munda, who's been very seminal in the framing of your argument. Your comments, responses, just to trigger off the discussion.
Thank you, Sangeeta. It's a very thoughtful question. Yes, I think the field of what we're calling the humanities in India is very much an open field. There's also this sense that human dignity is what has become what is called an open norm. So I think that sense of openness and interdisciplinary and intercultural dialogue is very important. So that's in relation to your first comment. It's very much an unwritten script. It's an unwritten text, social text, and let's work together on that, making it fully inclusive, multilingual, multicultural. Anyhow, Jaipal Singh, I think, is an important figure, perhaps more in relation to what we might think of as an international indigeneity. Birsa wasn't particularly international. I think the critique can come in when we think of Indian National Congress and other national representations of Adivasi people and culture, which is that it does tend to be localized. And that can both be important and powerful and respectful, you know, for example, of the 5th schedule, but it can also be rather paternalistic and trivializing because it may exclude international experiences of Adivasis. And it also may exclude now the international forum for collective indigenous empowerment that operates in various domains, including the UN. So Jaipal Singh, I think, you know, let us not try and too narrowly define Adivasi citizenship, but see also Adivasi citizenship in terms of global citizenship. This again is very much an unwritten future that lies ahead of all of us, because two things. One is Adivasi experiences and history and culture is very, very lesser known worldwide compared to, let's say, indigenous North America or indigenous Australia. So we might want to confront that. We might want to ask, why is that so? Why do people not know that there are approximately 100 million Adivasis or indigenous peoples in India? But we may also want to think about the possibility of so-called South-South connectedness and South-South solidarity here. And this is why I was interested in saying that Claire mentioned earlier, which is about the sort of the pan-indigenous experience. I think culture is a very important way to ascertain those spaces of South-South solidarity and creativity. But of course, political empowerment goes much beyond that. Sure.
Yeah, Claire?
So I found that whole thing fascinating. I took masses of notes, but I can see there's some people who've come in Jordan Ralph's one, Gary Jackson's here with me, who have co-authored an article that we wrote on the archaeology of racism in Northern Australia, and I can send people the link to it. But what it was really about the structural racism in the society for Aboriginal people. So they go into town, there's lots of, you know, the toilets are closed because they don't want Aboriginal people using them. They want to buy alcohol, they have to show, it's really difficult. They have to show where they're going to live. Everybody has to show where they're going to live, but if you're a European person, then, you know, it's easier. Lots of things there. And what I was thinking just the other day is the thing that upset people most was the loss of dignity. And so what your talk today, and I'm sure Jordan and Jacko, who's here, hiding, and I think that really does spark that for me. That's what people want. I was thinking maybe it's what people want more than anything is to have dignity, you know, to just be treated well in some way. Aboriginal people would call it respect. They talk about it as respect. Anyway, I really appreciated what you said. I don't think I've added anything to it very much, but
you mentioned a very important word that I don't think I included in the talk, which is respect.
Okay.
There's, I think, through the UN as well, an interesting link between all of that structural racism, disciplinary racism, and so forth, and labour conditions that has since evolved into a responsibility to respect program. I think it is there. It may not be particularly relevant to us, but there is very much a sort of a philosophy of respect that organisations like UNESCO have tried to cultivate. And so this is where I think, you know, if I may just reflect on 2 points. One is, you know, how we all kind of work with these terms like respect, dignity, and so forth, because they do operate very much as kind of guides for policy, including on sustainability. And so they're not politically neutral, even though they're sort of aspirational and largely helpful, you know, if we're involved in this sort of positive peace movement. They're also political, enabling certain kinds of investments, certain kinds of knowledge to come about, certain kinds of relationships to come about, and so forth. So I think, you know, they need to be drilled down into, and this is why I'm interested in what I've become sort of interested in. I mean, it's this idea of what's called a transversal philosophy, or a transversal idea, one that cuts through institutions in unusual and unanticipated ways. So for example, if a university is threatened with closure, let's say, and there's a move to sort of generate a consciousness of solidarity, whatever, the way then that permeates into that university and its future and its capacity to act, people think about, you know, in terms of transversality, you know, this non-hierarchical, non-horizontal, but important sort of combination of vectors. And that's where I think a lot of these terms can also come into play, you know, because they cut through policies, they also cut into academic actions and academic responsiveness. And so they're very non-linear in a sense. Okay, if that kind of makes any sense. But yes, I mean, and then the other point, you know, is really about then where that leaves us, either as a, you know, as networks of academics or individuals or representatives of one program or another, because my sense is that we need to consolidate our responsiveness in such a way that whatever we deliver through the humanities or any kind of Adivasi Lives Matter kind of program or anti-racist program actually counts for something and isn't just kind of left out. So there's that interesting kind of need, I think, for academics to be able to speak back better and differently. And that, to my mind, is part and parcel of academic social responsibility, to get to a point where we're able to speak collectively and clearly on these issues.
If I can just briefly, and I don't want to distract, but I think something that came up the other day working with an Aboriginal woman, Jasmine Williker, who I've worked with for a long time, and I do a field school where students do stuff, and she said, and we decided that instead of the people doing something for Aboriginal people, they would do the research with Aboriginal people. So then the thing I'm thinking of here is Aboriginal people or Adivasi people researching their own past. And it seems to me there's a difference between being a researcher rather than being researched, the object of research.
I think collaborative research is very important. You know, I think, you know, we're in kind of a new era now where, yeah, knowledge creation has to be inclusive. And I think, you know, to some extent, the interventions that Indigenous academics have made in, let's say, North America with this kind of idea of Indigenous archaeology, You know, the need for a new kind of scholarship and science, you know, in the wake of policies like NAGPRA. I mean, that's quite far-sighted, and Indigenous archaeologists are actually precisely that. You know, they bridge the divide.
And they are wonderfully powerful when they choose to be.
Okay, we have a question here from Dr. Roshni. Can tribal dignity be articulated in the language of the politics of the state, or is a new terminology needed?
Yes, I think a new terminology is needed. I think this is where, you know, one of the principles that underpins the Agenda 2030 is very interesting, the pro-people approach. So making lives matter, making people matter in a way that doesn't ignore the influence and the responsibilities of the state, but that is driven by more singularly kind of human concerns. You know, not wanting to become too pessimistic, I don't think we're in a context now where governments are particularly well equipped to usher in pro-people policies, or even to respond to, you know, what we've been talking about in terms of human responsibility or social responsibility. So that's why the program, you know, these kinds of programs that usher in more space for that, I think, you know, are valuable. And you know, just looking at the past decades, I mean, there has, in Jharkhand, for example, been some governmental and state level responsiveness to these issues, but there's also been some governmental and state level destruction of heritage sites pertaining to Adivasi history and rebellion.
I have a question. This conversation made me think also of, you know, it's interesting you brought up the question of dignity in relation to Adivasi, you know, Adivasi histories and Adivasi experience. I think this has been articulated in Dalit studies quite forcefully. And in Dalit studies, I think some of the center part has been, you know, this idea, so if I can quote or take example of Gopal Guru, who's one of the, you know, Dalit social scientists. Humiliation is one of the big questions of how, you know, humiliation and the ability to articulate the experience of humiliation that other people cannot recognize. And I think, you know, this is something that Claire kind of talked about, this sort of everyday humiliation. And this humiliation is really crushing in the experience of caste, right? Where in the experience of Adivasis, as you've shown, there is a kind of, because there was a sort of romanticism in some way, you know, as, you know, within art or within this cultural framework, and this idea, even Gandhi himself saying, you know, Adivasis are sort of outside of this civilization, this noble savage kind of idea that takes them. I think the humiliation might be differently understood by at least the upper caste or the Savarna society than it is with Dalits, right? And so I'm wondering how you think this can articulate this idea of human dignity as a field when we have, you know, the movements and the intellectual movements of the Dalits, and then on the other hand, this this historicity of Adivasis.
I mean, what an important question. It's something that I haven't addressed. I'll be frank with you. It's something that I have thought about in the past, though, in terms of capacities to combine themes across Dalit studies and Adivasi studies. But I have yet to do much on that in terms of human dignity. So those comments are very helpful and enlightening. I think what we can aim for potentially is a series of dialogues on dignity. I mean, these are potentially forums for inclusion whereby different views on precisely that issue can come about. My experience of trying to combine too closely Adivasi studies with Dalit studies in Jharkhand has tended to be met with some skepticism by Adivasi scholars and Adivasi representatives. So where there's skepticism, where there are, you know, potential difficulties, therein lies, you know, some sort of need to tease out the dialogue and the dialogic.
That's a very interesting thing too, because I think this, you know, the caste is kind of the experience of caste between the different kind of groups that we group as marginal is also sort of different, and therefore the field or the theorization of dignity as a political project also is different, I think, is sort of maybe what in some ways. So this is, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, can I come in on this for a moment?
Sure.
Yeah, so in Jharkhand, you now do have such issues being discussed. And so if you look at the writings of, say, those like Ruby Hembrom, who now has her own publishing house, Adivani, these kinds of issues are being raised and discussed. But as Dan pointed out, our experiences were similar at one point of time when you had Adivasi intellectuals from Jharkhand not being on the same page with Dalit intellectuals. So somewhere that was also a glitch. But now I think, once again, Dan, they are moving together. So you do have organizations where you have, say, for example, organizations like BAPSA, which do bring in Adivasi voices and Dalit voices together. So things are now moving on in terms of different marginalized voices coming together, which was not something that was happening earlier. And secondly, as I said, in terms of Adivasis, talking about this experiential aspect, we do have, particularly in Jharkhand, because I'm aware of Jharkhand, not of other regions, this is coming up in a major way.
Thanks, Sangeeta.
Just a small thing. I know we have a few Australian people who've tuned in. Could someone please explain the difference between Adivasi and Dalit?
Shall I have a quick go? Broadly speaking, we have to think about a long time frame. The historic assimilation of indigenous peoples into the caste system accounts for generally speaking, accounts for the groups known as scheduled castes or Dalits. And where the indigenous populations hadn't and haven't been as assimilated into any kind of Sanskritized economy or society, where there's clearer distance and differentiation with the so-called mainstream society, these indigenous populations are Adivasi. So being Dalit, you have, or one has a much longer participation or sense of exclusion from Hinduism. Is that fine,
Yep.
fellow sociologists?
Seems perfect to me.
Yeah, so are there any, I mean, other questions? Anybody would like to add anything?
I just wanted to highlight one other point, and it relates to Sangeeta's mentioning of Adivani, which is the role of language in all this as we move forward, because India's new national education policy, though not a perfect document, does have a heightened provision for education in the so-called 8th schedule languages. So that provides some interesting impetus for Adivasi learners to learn in mother tongue languages, which is going to potentially change their educational and scholarly prospects and experiences. So I think that's something that we would need to look out for in the future, you know, is the extent to which, you know, perhaps unknowingly we're contributing to certain kinds of exclusion just by virtue of the linguistic predominance of English, Hindi, Bengali, and what have you.
Okay, so Rahi Soren, Professor Rahi Soren has a comment. Dignity is perceived by Adivasis and Dalits differently. As Dalits are in the Hindu fold, historically, they've been discriminatory towards Adivasis as well. So she's mentioning that. Yeah. On the question,
and even into Adivasi, you know, there's conflict as well. I mean, it's not as if being Adivasi is a harmonious and straightforward identity. You know, the Willem van Schendel in the book Politics of Belonging wrote very interestingly about the dangers of belonging. And you know, there are obviously conflicts as well between Bodo and Santal, or have been, between Bodo and Santal tribal groups in different parts of northeastern India, just to take one example. So, you know, what happens to human dignity in that sort of situation? You know, we need to be quite kind of probing, I think.
Right. If I could just add something to what you said about language, since that's, you know, I work on it. I feel that language, not you know, sort of in all periods, but at least in the most recent period, has really become a source of dignity for Adivasi communities, and that same thing is not perhaps allowed for non-Adivasi communities, like for Dalits, for instance. So in a lot of Dalit discourse, there's a lot of sort of antipathy towards a vernacular language in favor of English, you know, in order to modernize. And this goes with the Ambedkar line. Whereas in the Adivasi communities, it's really this idea that they have a separate language, and now making a separate scripts. You know, as we know in Jharkhand, most of the communities now are really promoting their scripts and everything like this, in order, and that allows you know, a kind of measure of dignity with their independent cultural identity that people who are, you know, not considered as separate, right, or not considered as having their own culture or own language have, I think.
You're absolutely right, Nishant. It's a very important issue. It'd be really interesting to see how those kinds of issues transpire. And, you know, I'd obviously welcome follow-up engagements on that precise point.
Some more questions by Arjun Bhai.
Yeah.
You can ask, yeah.
Yeah, I was listening that Adivasi democracy and democracy in Adivasi. What is this Adivasi democracy and how it is different from Adivasi in democracy? What has inspired you to use this word, Adivasi democracy?
It comes from Radhakamal Mukherjee's work from the 1920s, when he was trying to ascertain the status, both historical and in terms of present-day India, of regional democracies and regional economics. So he was trying to arrive at a sense of understanding of, for example, the political institutions of Mundas, Santals, and many others. He wasn't an anthropologist, but he was a sociologist trying to understand and also create some kind of fabric, a knitted together or a fabric of multiple sites of democratic participation and all the kind of values that transpire through that participation. So he arrived at this very interesting sense of India's kind of plural and pluralistic political heritage, and tried to account for that and tried to accommodate the political experiences and political institutions of these minority groups from the 1920s. And so the point is, in ascertaining that, he was also giving fuel or helping to drive forward this idea of tribal integration, which became very, very important in Indian anthropology in the 1930s. Because without the notion of tribal integration and experiences of these tribal or Adivasi democratic institutions as functioning, there would not have been a sense of tribal identity in India. And so on the back of all that, you get provision for tribal identities, tribal citizenship, and the scheduled tribe concept, in its use of the word tribe, pertains to these areas of and histories of tribal settlement that account for and also develop through political strength and political survival, which is very important, I think.
Yeah, Daniel, just in relation to what Mr. Rathwa has cautioned about, because you were referring to the indigenous communities in North America and Australia, and how they are reasserting their identities in terms of sovereignty and their own cultural heritage. And like, it's almost like what they define as decolonization and redefining the narratives. So it's very much close to what the question raised by Mr. Rathwa. Arjunji has rightly said that it's about Adivasi, democracy of Adivasi of their own. It's more about sovereignty, you know, how the Adivasi autonomy and sovereignty. So how do you relate the sovereignty rights of Adivasi autonomous region, apart from what we have as 5th and 6th schedule, which is just give them an, you know, connectivity to land, which is also not, it's also a stipulated kind of a system. It doesn't give them a comprehensive sovereignty of their own. So how will you relate the situation of Indian tribal or Indian diverse cultural communities in context to the indigenous communities in different, like, especially in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada and North America? How you relate these?
I think, you know, in terms of indigenous studies and people kind of familiar with different versions of indigeneity or different sort of histories of exclusion, inclusion, and all that, one needs to arrive at a relatively loose sense of what indigenous empowerment is, and then to, within that slightly kind of loose assemblage, then try and ascertain the specifics, because it's very much not one size fits all, you know, in terms of making comparisons internationally or even across India. So there's, I think from my side, a note of caution there. I would go so far as to say that, you know, I think we need to do what we can to create an understanding of why and how these constitutional provisions came in, you know, in terms of the 5th schedule and the 6th schedule. You mentioned earlier, Bina, in your talk about the sort of threatening of the status of and visibility of these identities, you know, scheduled tribes, scheduled area, and so forth in your talk. And, you know, they're there in the Constitution for a reason, because the makers of the nation didn't want Adivasis to be alienated from their own sense of belonging.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Just to my mind, you know, if we're to take kind of a holistic approach, we need to understand all of this, you know, in the context of a political heritage, really. One that accounts for and enables Adivasis to respond to these provisions and to respond to their own experiences of of democracy, of alienation to some extent. There wouldn't be this continuing movement or Adivasi consciousness around Jal, Jangal, and Jameen if there wasn't a threat on water security, human security, livelihoods, welfare, well-being, and so forth. So it's because we exist in an economy that threatens these livelihoods and threatens the capacity of many Adivasis to sort of respond positively to their economy, their heritage, that we need to do what we can to sort of tease that out. But I'm not going to, I think, go any further than that, because I don't see myself as a spokesperson of Adivasi political claims per se. I think, anthropologists, historians have a slightly different role to play in teasing out these things.
I will further add, like, for example, even though we are talking about not to have an alienation of these communities, yet 5th and 6th schedule could not maintain that kind of, the sanctity of the sovereignty or the cultural, they could not retain to a very large extent. For example, already Mr. Rathwa had, Arjunji had already mentioned about so many tribal communities of MP and UP have been converted into, the delisting has already taken place. So even though there was a certain amount of land, non-land and alienation was guaranteed to them, but it has not been able to suffice it completely, just because the autonomy was not given to them. And it just doesn't goes, and it goes to a lot of communities, even in Rajasthan. For example, the whole Chittorgarh area lost many of its Bhil communities to the inclusive policy systems, and assimilation marred many of the communities. Same goes in many parts of the Surat and parts of Gujarat as well. It's going rampantly in Maharashtra right now. Like, a lot of tribal communities have lost their tribal status, or even if they have retained the tribal status, the land alienation is very much evident because of so much of corruption and other hindered pressures. So in such case, don't you see there is certain kind of course, although you said that there are some historical glitches to it, and historians have to play an important role too. And not only historians from the mainstream, a lot of historical narrative has to come from the community itself. As you said about indigenous archaeology and indigenous historical narratives. So where you will place in, what are the main lines of difference between Indian scenario and in the global north, or the, I would still say, the white dominated continents of Americas and Australia? Because this is what the language used by the indigenous in those parts of the world. So how will you define that?
I think it's a very difficult task right for now, but I think, you're right in highlighting these concerns, because there doesn't, to my mind, seem to be a huge amount of connectivity between Adivasi sociologists or people, really connected to those issues that you were raising, Bina, with others around the other indigenous populations, or indeed other activists worldwide. I mean, the UN and the participation of the ICITP at the UN was, I think, relatively productive for a while, but I don't think that's going on. And I think it's no surprise to anybody, to think about how the Indian government, may kind of curtail representativeness of Adivasis at the UN. I don't think that's something that they would encourage. Well, primarily because the BJP doesn't really have a very sensitive response to the idea of Adivasi. They speak more in terms of the Vanavasi peoples.
Yeah, that's true.
As we know, it doesn't really hold a huge amount of traction amongst Adivasi activists. Yeah, so I mean, to my mind, it's a space that needs to be cultivated very carefully, in terms of this international indigenous movement for solidarity and understanding. It's a role that you know, the big organizations like UNESCO and so forth perhaps could take up if they felt so inclined, but that may be a rather distant prospect. So, you know, if these guys aren't going to do it, then, you know, it's up to you and me and everybody else to try and cultivate the sort of kinds of knowledge, understanding, and the sort of conversations that we think are important, you know, that are not possible, you know, when the politicians have different priorities. So you know, there's certainly something to think about. But just a final reflection, if I may, on your question of sovereignty. I think I wanted to sort of allude to something Sangeeta was saying earlier, you know, about the role of historical memory, because it's a sovereignty that, like in the Australian context, you know, does allow for a combination of a productive and rich interplay between past and present. You know, it's a consciousness that doesn't necessarily exclude the past in the present in that sense. So when Santal activists are talking about Adivasi self-rule in Jharkhand, or movements for enhanced Adivasi self-determination and all of that, or a kind of a more assertive response to threats, you know, against the constitutional status of certain lands and so forth, they're doing so in the knowledge that the rebellions of the 19th century are very much a kind of an unfinished business, that the constitutional provisions given are helpful, but they're not the full story. So therein is an interesting prospect for contemporary Adivasis in terms of their capacity and their ability to invoke these previous rebel leaders, you know, as coexistent in their program of today. So there's an interesting sort of multi-dimensional facet to the invocation of Sidhu, Santal, Sidhu Murmu, in other words, as Thakur, or Birsa as Bhagwan. You know, all these kinds of things, to my mind, are very important in terms of how the imaginary of Adivasi sovereignty and Adivasi citizenship is playing out now. It's playing out in a way that does allow for a really interesting combination of past, present, and future temporalities, which, you know, if we were familiar with Indigenous studies in Australia, is an important phenomena. Intertemporality. So, anyhow, I mean, there's too much there really, perhaps, to unpack for now. But
it's an
great
ongoing.
to have the opportunity to talk with you about it. Thank you, Nishant.
We have. Should we take one more question? Is that okay? Yeah. So somebody asked about the different perspectives of Gandhi and Elvin. Larry or Elvin, I don't know if you want to talk about that. And I'll add maybe in respect to also human dignity. Like what do you think is a different perspective of them in relation to human dignity and Adivasi citizenship?
So I think Vera Elwin is a really important figure here, and I alluded to him, and I didn't really go into too much detail about him because I wrote that paper, Anthropology as Satyagraha, which goes into quite a lot of detail about his commitment to Gandhian principles and his capacity to build bridges, you know, between the colonialists, the nationalists, different Adivasi societies, and so forth. So, you know, he was very much a bridge builder. So it's really interesting about the, you know, to analyze, understand, and analyze the ways he did that. And one can see in his anthropology, different kinds of anthropology all sort of coming together and developing a combination. You know, he was trying to kind of, on the one hand, address colonialist interest in racial difference, for example. So there was bits and bobs of, you know, these very outdated and problematic kind of physical anthropological observations and what have you. But then he was also very interested in the lived culture and ecology of Central Indian Adivasi populations such as the Baiga. So one can read into his, you know, documentation of various stories, various dreamings, various biographies, his assessment of all of that in relationship to a vulnerable set of cultural institutions and a vulnerable ecology. Very, very interesting. And you know, I think he was an important figure in, perhaps much more than Gandhi was, you know, in the later kind of rehabilitation of this idea of tribal or Adivasi identity in the constitution. So, you know, to that end, he was quite different from Gandhi because he was much more actively involved in it. But I think he, broadly speaking, achieved what he set out to achieve, which was a greater sensibility in the mainstream sort of national consciousness in India of what was at stake if people, you know, ignored or marginalized these traditions and these cultural formations as expressed by modern day Adivasis. Okay.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk.